Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities with the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. And United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina, delighted this week to be talking with John Kaehny, Executive Director and co-founder of Reinvent Albany. Reinvent Albany is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, tax-exempt charitable organization that promotes open, accountable New York State government with an interest in government transparency and public participation. John Kaehny, welcome back to the Capital Connection.
Thank you for having me.
Well, obviously, all eyes were on the State of the State address this week, and the governor basically rolling out a wish list of sorts. She focused on things like housing, crime, and mental health. She even has a major proposal for AI. I wonder just initially, John, if you could give us your reaction to the governor's State of the State address this week.
Sure. I think this year's State of the State was very much about it being a presidential election year. And physically, who is she talking to? The fact that she's in the assembly chambers directly in front of the leaders of the Senate and the Assembly who are standing behind her. And this matters for a bunch of reasons. One thing to consider is that it's very cramped and that there's very few guests. No real public are there. And this is interesting because it reduces, I think, the chance of demonstrations and disruptions from everything from climate activists to people concerned about Gaza, Israel, Palestinians, to fill in the blank. And there's been an increase in disruptions of and heckling of public officials, and I think they're very concerned about that in the legislature this year, where they've reduced public access to the Capitol. And compare this to past years where other governors have held the State of the State, for instance, in the Egg, and had thousands of guests. So I think that matters, and this is as much about what the governor talks about as didn't talk about. And to that end, it's a presidential election year. We all know that. Her party's candidate, President Joe Biden, Democrat, is describing it as a struggle for the survival of democracy itself. Very stark terms, very high stakes. The National Democratic Party is counting on picking up many House seats to Congress in New York via a redistricting process that was not even mentioned. And there's some big hot-button national issues related to that, including, of course, migrants. That really didn't get talked about in the speech. So the national context matters a great deal in the governor's State of the State speech this year. And I think that it was very conservative with a small c in that way, because she does not want to rock the Democratic vote, especially in the suburbs of New York City.
Let's continue with the idea of these national issues. You referenced it. We're talking about the migrant crisis from the New York Times. Perhaps the most striking was what she did not list as among the state's top concerns, addressing the migrant crisis, which has seen tens of thousands of immigrants from all over the world travel to seek shelter in New York City, overwhelming the city's social services and costing billions. They've made their way upstate as well, and that was one of the big issues for Republicans in criticizing her State of the State address. How could you overlook the migrant crisis, which in one place, New York City, has been huge?
That's right, and the governor has to politically thread the needle on a number of issues where she has a progressive wing of her party that is in a totally different place than suburban Democrat and independent voters that the Democratic House candidates want to appeal to. I mean, the list of other things that she didn't talk about, which, my group, Reinvent Albany, touched on too were, what happened to the transparency governor, the governor that said, I'm going to be clean, and a big contrast to, previous secretive and less inclusive governors. What happened to that governor who talked about about political accountability? And to that end, about being conservative, the governor didn't, we mentioned, talk about redistricting at all, which is a huge national deal. Of course, she doesn't control it, but it matters. So if this was a state of the state where you actually talked about important things, the most important things, she would have to talk about migrants, redistricting, her veto of the of the the state legislature's attempt to water down or even destroy the brand new small donor campaign finance system that New York is adopting, which is a political hot button for sure in Albany, and repeatedly made legislative leaders very unhappy that she vetoed their bill to weaken the public matching system, which my group strongly supports, as do voting groups and others. But so the governor just had to stay away from certain things because she didn't want to anger and antagonize the legislature. She's standing in their house right in front of them, which is a pretty cramped space to jam the Senate and Assembly into, by the way. So there's a very kind of cramped, jammed aspect to it. And what she presented were 19 big policy areas with more than 200 proposals, a lot of which are good ideas, and I think most people would be like, hey, okay, that's fine, that's cool, let's do it, but aren't really big themes. And that's because the governor, again, had to be conservative. So even when talking about very high stakes political issues like crime and mental health, she had to be careful to not antagonize parts of her own party that have spent the last couple of years really going after, over policing and over incarceration. And she did that in an interesting way, which is by introducing kind of this victim-centered idea around crime, specifically mentioning a Queen's domestic violence program, and by mentioning repeatedly her concerns about women and children and the vulnerable. And that seems like it's going to be her and perhaps the Democratic playbook for talking about crime and, public homeless mental health issues going forward. So it's not to sort of, so they can politically have it both ways. But what jumps out to us as a government watchdog group, again, is just how there's really not that much in it about the big issues of the day. We mentioned migrants. We mentioned the voting, redistricting, public campaign finance issue, which, again, seems a little obscure, perhaps to the general public, but is something that's got the legislature steamed, especially incumbents who fear it's going to threaten them. She didn't talk much about the work of transforming what's a pretty complex, creaky, complicated, super expensive state government into a operation that can really deal with the fast threats that are coming at us from climate change, which migration is related to, and these bigger societal issues. And she had to also soft shoe the whole issue of promoting housing, affordable housing in particular, and increased housing construction in suburban New York, which is really she took a big swing at last year, was totally rebuffed by the legislature for her efforts to, as they would put it, Bigfoot suburbs of New York City into increasing their housing.
Local zoning laws took over there for many of those legislators.
And so and the governor's proposal last year, by the way, was lauded by many, independent analyst types as being the right policy, but the politics were not good. And our understanding is that she has been specifically asked by national Democrats to not even talk about housing in the suburbs because they're so concerned about the backlash for House elections. So again, on the theme of being very constrained by national politics, you have all these issues that are drawing the public's attention: migrants, housing. Those are top issues, and the governor can't really talk about them. Feels constrained talking about them. And then you have these issues of democracy, reform, transparency, where they might be considered contentious for her to talk about in front of the legislature in their own house. So she's really having to find a grab bag of things that shows that she's doing something, and that's what she did.
We're speaking with John Kaehny. He is the executive director and co-founder of Reinvent Albany, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, tax-exempt charitable organization that promotes open, accountable New York State government. Well, one of the big things, of course, is that the federal money, COVID money, all that stuff is basically gone now, and we're sitting with a $4.3 billion budget deficit. I mean, that certainly impacts the governor and what she can do going forward. And despite all the pros in the State of the State address, the real issue will be, what does the budget say next week?
That's exactly right, David. It's, the money talks, the nonsense walks is the old phrase. And what's in the governor's budget is matters much more than the State of the State address, which I think was more about the governor staying out of trouble than it was about proposing anything grand and new. And so all eyes will be on the literal bottom line and how much is going into each budget line. A couple things, though, on the state's budget picture. It's actually quite good. The revenue estimates have come in consistently higher. The state significantly reduced the estimated out-year deficit over the last couple months, and the state has $19.5 billion or more in rainy day funds and other reserves. So it's not a austerity budget, but I should have mentioned this at the top. The key thing for many is that the governor said she's not going to raise taxes, and so that's going to be on anybody. And so that's going to be one of just the fundamental battle lines between, in particular, progressive Democrats and the governor in the budget debate.
No question about it. The battle lines, because the state is controlled by Democrats, are between the more progressives in her party and the more centrists like the governor. And while you have mentioned crime as part of her speech, she's tending to go toward the victim angle.
Yeah, I think just in terms of what's interesting or new coming out of this, that could be something that national Democrats in suburban areas pick up on is the victim-centered look at crime through the prism of women and children, and emphasizing domestic violence and efforts to fight domestic violence. And it's fascinating that the governor's State of the State book mentions that a very large portion of violent crimes are domestic violence crimes in New York and nationally. And therefore, when you target domestic violence, you're targeting violent crime. And that's an interesting angle. And we'll have to see, how that plays and how much they hit on that thematically. But again, 200 plus specific policy proposals in 19 areas is a lot, and separating the kind of the wheat from the chaff is going to going to be hard to do until the exact budget, put your money where your mouth is time happens when the governor's budget comes out next week.
You know, we talk about this with any politician. When you're in office, you get blamed and you get credited. If things go well, you did good. If things go bad, you're not doing so well. And I noticed part of her State of the State address dealt with, in her words, chaos, retail theft. Now, we've seen crowds of young people going into stores and stealing, and we have retail theft as it is anyway. We've also seen this fight over bail reform and gun control and all this stuff sort of tangled up together. Even in Albany, where the district attorney, David Soares, is a Democrat, is not happy with the Democrats or the governor and how they are dealing with crime in the streets. And that clarion call the Republicans always use of law and order oftentimes is heard not only by the Republicans themselves, but even some of the Democrats, especially in the suburban areas.
Yeah, the crime numbers, and this is definitely an area of perception and where you have the parties trying to draw different pictures. I mean, the crime numbers statewide and in New York City and its suburbs are really pretty good for an incumbent governor. The crime is not going up, but high-profile incidents and a feeling of being threatened is showing up a lot in public opinion polls and getting a lot of coverage. So
where does that come from? Do you have any sense of where that comes from, John? I mean, if the facts are that crime is actually, in many categories, going down, why the perception?
Well, I think that using words like chaos and disorder and kind of what's being done is, in this case, a Republican generally critique of what's the collapse of Main Street, and which has continued upstate in New York terribly, so that we have a big struggle with poverty in the center cities of the smaller cities in the state. Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and in New York City, you have migrants who are, here and there on the street, but drawing tremendous amounts of press attention nationally. And you have mentally ill people on the streets and who are not receiving adequate services or are not being dealt with, tended to. And that creates a sense of disorder and insecurity. And so it all gets lumped together into a perception of, I don't like this. And that's something that's being, that the press likes the conflict narrative. They like to find stories that get a lot of eyeballs.
Well, it's the major criteria for what makes news, conflict.
It is.
No question about it.
And so the numbers just are not matching up with the public perception on crime and whether it's in New York City, on the street, in the subway, or upstate. That said, there are some areas that the governor really didn't talk about. The murder rate is very high in some upstate center cities, as we know, talking about statistics. There's no way around that. But that's not really the issue that suburban voters in the Mid-Hudson and Long Island care about. And that's really who the Democrats and the Republicans are trying to appeal to here. That's the key audience, because the core districts in New York City, Democratic districts, and, central Buffalo and Albany and whatnot, those aren't going to change. It's what are called marginal districts or the changeable districts, the purple districts that the fight's all about. And that's what this messaging is about, those suburban voters.
What about corporate welfare? I know that's a big thing on your list at Reinvent Albany, and we're speaking with John Kaehny, the executive director. Corporate welfare, we often talk about this when it comes to giving those who have a lot more to, for example, create public-private partnerships and things of that nature. What did you see in the State of the State address that might have your spider senses tingling over corporate welfare?
Knock on wood here, which I'm going to do, there weren't any catastrophically stupid boondoggles being proposed, which is great because the last couple of years have seen New York just lavishing billions of dollars on projects that are of questionable value to the public. I mean, I could name a few. Buffalo Bills Stadium, $1 billion in public subsidies for that. Micron, the Micron deal, I'm going to talk about that in a second. But really nothing that was just, oh God. From our perspective, we're by the way, we're big critics of corporate welfare because we try to be fact-based, and the facts just show that billions in corporate welfare, of which New York State and city and localities are spending about $10 billion every year in public funds in all forms on corporate welfare, which is just, gosh, that's a lot of money. So we think the facts don't support the kind of big spending on boondoggle projects that New York's really been into. But Micron, gosh, Governor Hochul, we really wish you would stop claiming that Micron.
Let's remind listeners that Micron is this chip maker they want to put in central New York, and they want to have people educated and trained so that they can tie in, this public-private partnership can tie in not only to business but to education.
Yeah, the big project that the governor likes to talk about at the drop of a hat is a plan to build a giant chip fabrication or chip fab plant in Clay, New York, which is really a tiny suburb of Syracuse. It is essentially Syracuse. And the governor claimed in her speech that Micron is going to spend $100 billion on this mega chip fab over the next decades. That's just absolute total baloney, which we've debunked repeatedly. And in fact, it's a Micron press release quoting Micron CEO saying, over time, Micron could spend upwards of $100 billion. So it's like me saying right now, Reinvent Albany could spend upwards of $500 billion on remaking all of central New York, or $5, So it's complete, total hyperbole. It's not going to happen. And we wish that the governor and other boosters of that project would be just slightly reality-based and abandon. It's not even hype. It's overhype. Because what Micron did say is that by 2030, that they're going to have a plant in place that they're going to put $20 to $40 billion into building, which is plenty. And that the state of New York will be taking in roughly $5 billion in subsidies of different kinds for. So it's still a big project, but it's not this $100 billion thing. And it's basically a lie, an outright fabrication. So the Micron and upstate chip fab mania is a big part of what's become a Democratic mythology about creating a new industrial revolution in upstate New York, which would be awesome and great to see, but it's probably not going to happen because of chip fabs, which are mainly robot factories that cost an enormous amount of money. So other than mentioning Micron in her State of the State, the governor didn't propose much that, is of the scale that would blow our minds. So she mentioned AI, Artificial Intelligence Center upstate, that some elite universities would kick in money for, as well as the state. That's to be seen whether that actually ever happens. And frankly, the amount of money mentioned is only $200 million in state funds versus, for instance, the state's annual film and TV tax credit, which is actually state reimbursement to Hollywood producers of $770 million a year for the next 11 years. So on the boondoggle alert, pretty minor on that one, but we've got our eyes on that and did feel in this area encouraged that the governor mentioned more workforce development efforts, which economists have shown are a much better use of public funds than these corporate handouts.
Yeah, and as you, John Kaehny of Reinvent Albany, talk about the wasting of public dollars in your analysis, there's this other issue that's been growing and growing and growing, not only in New York, but around the country, and that's food insecurity. And following the State of the State address each year, there's something called the People's State of the State address. I saw that press release, and they're all about poverty and food insecurity. And there's a lot of people in this state, not just people who are in poverty, but others who can barely pay the bills, that are going hungry.
Yeah, I mean, the things that are missing and interesting things that we would have liked to see but didn't show up in the governor's State of the State is an effort to look at what's the most cost-effective way to help, for instance, reduce food insecurity. There's a lot of different ways to structure programs. What's the best way to fund childcare, for instance, and help young mothers back into the workforce? What's the best way to do all these things? New York doesn't know because New York does not have credible independent analysis that it uses when it makes these big spending policy decisions. And unlike states like California or even New York City, New York does not have an independent budget office to score the real cost of different programs or of legislation. So a lot of Albany is flying blind when it comes to policy and spending decisions, and that promotes waste and unaccountability. So when we talk about things like transparency, we're also talking about more independent eyeballs and voices, like an independent budget office, which has been on the wish list of government reformers in New York for, 50 years or more, having a say and being able to actually add some reality and facts into the different discussions.
Finally, let me just ask you about this. The minimum wage has gone up, and we see a little bit more in New York than upstate, but still probably a far cry from what many have called for on the progressive side, which is a living wage that might help deter some of these other problems.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that happened during COVID, good things, was that there was the biggest experiment ever in how to reduce poverty. And it turns out that direct support, just giving people money, actually seems to be the most efficient way to reduce, for instance, child poverty. And this issue is coming to the fore because, as you noted at the onset, the COVID money is gone or drying up. And so it really matters how you spend money and spending it efficiently. And if you waste money, it hurts the poor and the most vulnerable the most, because they are the ones that depend on the government and the funding the most. So for groups like us who believe that government is crucial to solving many big societal problems, we think equally crucial is that government has to spend the limited money it has well. And so the governor did mention a couple of analytics programs scattered here and there throughout her 200 proposals, which we strongly support, but didn't really talk about making programs and government more fact and data driven so that the public and the most vulnerable will get the biggest bang from tax dollars.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm David Guistina. Our guest has been John Kaehny, Executive Director and co-founder of Reinvent Albany. To find out more, head to reinventalbany.org. John, I can't thank you enough. I hope you'll come back again and talk to us on the Capital Connection.
Love to. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Guistina. Support for The Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.